Are you making this posterior pelvic tilt mistake? Go ahead and watch the video to find out. So if you've been watching my channel or other channels that are similar, you'll know that it's important to be able to access certain movement options within the rib cage and the pelvis. And one of the most important options to be able to access in the pelvis is a posterior pelvic tilt. Now, some of the main reasons that we want to be able to access this posterior pelvic tilt is that it helps us to open up mobility in the spine as well as the hips. But if you're making this common posterior pelvic tilt mistake, you might actually be accessing a little bit too much motion in your spine, which is actually preventing you from accessing motion within the hip. Over time, this can actually reduce your efficiency during movement and could be a possible contributing factor to some nagging aches and pains. Now, this posterior pelvic tilt mistake can really be described best by talking about how much movement is happening in the lumbar spine and how the rest of the body reacts in terms of positions down below the pelvis, as well as our center of gravity. So if we're doing this correctly, what we're going to see is a very subtle tipping back of the pelvis in space. We're going to get a tiny bit of motion here at the lowest part of the lumbar spine, but overall our center of gravity is going to stay relatively similar, and we're not going to have to do anything funky like bending our knees or doing something funky at our hips. On the flip side, if we do this mistake, what we're going to see is a lot of movement here at the lumbar spine and a tucking under of the pelvis that's actually going to make us have to shift back in space a little bit further than we should and to bend at the knees. And so this is not what we want to do, because in this case what we're usually doing is we're actually just opening up this lumbar spine a little bit too much and closing down the back of the pelvis, which will ultimately limit our mobility in the hips. So first, doing it correctly, what we're going to see is the top half of that pelvis moving back ever so slightly. My center of gravity stays the same. I didn't have to bend my knees, and we had very slight movement in the lumbar spine. Now, to do the posterior pelvic tilt mistake, it would be tucking the hips way under. You'll see that my knees start to bend. My weight shifts a little bit too much into the heels to the point where the toes want to lift up. And I'm getting most of the movement here in the lumbar spine, and actually a lot of tightening in this lower pelvic area, which is actually going to start to limit my access to certain mobility at the hips. So if you're making this mistake, here are a few cues that can help you out. If you're finding value in this video so far, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and like this video. All these things help the algorithm to help me help more people. So you're going to stand with your weight centered over the middle part of your foot so that you have contact in the toes, the middle part of the foot, and your heels. From this position, I want you to imagine that you either have a belt on or you have pockets in the back of your pants, and that somebody is just gently pulling that belt or the top half of the pockets back. As you do this, you're going to feel the top half of your pelvis go back, and you might feel your center of gravity come back just a little bit more towards the heels. Now, it shouldn't come back to the point where you have to lift the toes, so if you had to lift the toes, reset, start again, and go a little bit more subtle. Think about that top half of the pelvis relaxing back. And if it helps you to think about this, you could think about that front half of the pelvis, starting at the pubic bone, just pulling up ever so slightly. Now, if you feel like you're losing position and your toes start to come up, I'd encourage you just to shift your body back forward in space, which actually might give you a little bit more curve here in the lumbar spine. And starting from a position of a little bit more curvature, you might find that that posterior pelvic tilt is actually a little bit easier to do correctly. You'll get a little bit of movement just at the very bottom part of that lumbar spine while still maintaining a normal amount of arch. Now, once you have this down and standing, you can practice this in a number of positions. I recommend you do all fours, hook lying, 90-90, and side lying. And make sure that when you're doing exercises in those positions, if you are trying to bias a posterior pelvic tilt, do it in this subtle way, not in that big obvious way where most of the motion's happening through the lumbar spine. If you do this, you're going to find that you're opening up that hip mobility and you're getting just enough movement at the lumbar spine, which is actually going to make your movements a lot more efficient, and you'll find that you're hanging on to that mobility that you're trying to access through your exercises. Now, if you want to go a little bit more in depth on this concept and other similar concepts, go down to the link in the description and sign up for my new group movement coaching program. We're going to be going deeper on concepts just like this so that you can move and feel better. Okay, so that does it for this video. As always, thanks a lot for watching. Like the video, comment, subscribe, share, all those things. And until next time, peace.